December 12, 1944. The transport truck climbed higher into the Colorado Rockies, its engine groaning against the steep grade and accumulating snow. Inside, 17 German women prisoners huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. They wore thin military-issue coats that had been designed for European winters, not the brutal cold of American mountain elevations. Through the canvas covering, they caught glimpses of pine forests, heavy with snow and peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. Bertha Meyer pressed her face close to a gap in the canvas, watching the landscape grow increasingly remote and hostile. At 24 years old, she had served as a radio technician for the Wehrmacht, captured during the Allied push through France just 3 months earlier. She had expected to be held in one of the large prisoner camps she had heard about in Texas or Kansas. Instead, she and 16 other women had been diverted to this isolated facility, a converted logging camp high in the mountains where, they were told, they would be kept separate from the male prisoner population. The truck finally lurched to a stop, and the women were ordered out into ankle-deep snow. The cold hit Bertha like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. Around her, the other women stumbled from the vehicle, their faces reflecting shock at the temperature and the remoteness of their new prison. The facility before them consisted of several wooden barracks arranged in a clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering pines and mountains that looked more like walls than landscape. Lieutenant Arthur Calloway stood waiting for them, his fur-lined coat and thick gloves a stark contrast to their inadequate clothing. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, looking more like a librarian than a military officer. Behind him stood 3 other soldiers, all of them wearing heavy winter gear and carrying hunting rifles alongside their service weapons. These men looked different from the military police who had guarded them at previous facilities. They moved with the ease of people who belonged in this landscape, their faces weathered by sun and wind. "Welcome to Camp 12, Lieutenant Calloway said, his voice tight with what might have been discomfort at the women's obvious suffering in the cold. "You'll be housed in Barracks 3 and 4. Sergeant Stone will show you to your quarters and explain the camp regulations. I suggest you get inside quickly before frostbite sets in." Sergeant Caleb Stone stepped forward. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to assess the women, not as enemies, but as people woefully unprepared for where they found themselves. "Follow me," he said simply, then turned and walked toward the nearest barracks. The women hurried after him, desperate to escape the cold that was already turning their fingers numb. The barracks offered shelter from the wind but little warmth. 2 wood-burning stoves sat at either end of the long room, but the fire in them was modest, barely enough to take the edge off the freezing air. Bertha and the other women gathered around the nearest stove, rubbing their hands and stamping their feet to restore circulation. The building itself was sturdy enough, built from thick logs that had been chinked against drafts, but it was clear that this facility had never been intended as a winter residence for people without proper cold-weather gear. Ilse Wagner, a former nurse from Berlin, who at 28 was one of the older women in the group, examined the thin wool blankets that had been left on each bunk. "These won't be enough," she said quietly in German. "Not up here. We'll need to share body heat at night or we'll freeze." The first meal arrived an hour later, carried in by Private Ethan Brooks, a young soldier who looked barely old enough to shave. He set down a large pot of thin soup and a basket containing perhaps 20 slices of bread for 17 women, his face colored with what might have been embarrassment as he avoided making eye contact with the prisoners. "Dinner," he mumbled, then left quickly. Bertha ladled out portions, making sure each woman received an equal share. The soup was mostly water, with a few pieces of potato and carrot floating in it. The bread was stale, but edible. Together, it was perhaps half of what they needed to maintain their strength, especially in this cold. She had been hungry before during the long retreat across France, but this was different. This was a hunger that would be sustained, day after day, with no hope of foraging or supplementing their rations. That night, as the women huddled together under shared blankets, Bertha heard quiet crying from several bunks. Krista Bauer, the youngest at just 19, was sobbing into her pillow, trying to muffle the sound. Bertha moved to sit beside her, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "We'll survive this," she whispered. We've survived worse. But had they? Krista looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. I'm so cold, she said. And so hungry. How long can we last like this? Bertha had no answer. She looked around the barracks at the other women, all of them shivering despite being fully clothed under their blankets. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, howling through the pine trees with a sound that seemed almost alive. Through the small window near her bunk, she could see snow beginning to fall again, thick flakes that promised to bury them even deeper in this mountain prison. Somewhere in the distance, she heard what might have been a wolf howling, a sound that reminded her just how far they were from anything resembling civilization or safety. Morning brought 6 inches of fresh snow and the realization that their situation was becoming critical. The breakfast ration consisted of watery oatmeal and weak coffee, portions so small that Bertha felt hungrier after eating than before. Around her, the other women moved slowly, their bodies already weakening from inadequate nutrition, combined with the constant battle against cold. Elizabeth Lang, the oldest prisoner at 32, had developed a persistent cough during the night that worried everyone who heard it. Lieutenant Calloway appeared at mid-morning, his expression troubled as he surveyed the women. He spoke briefly with Sergeant Stone near the door, their voices low but urgent. Bertha, who had positioned herself close enough to overhear, caught fragments of their conversation. "Supply truck," Stone was saying, "stuck below the pass, won't make it through until the road clears, could be weeks." Calloway's response was too quiet to hear, but his face showed clear concern. After the lieutenant left, Sergeant Stone stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the women with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he turned and walked out into the snow. Through the window, Bertha watched as he gathered the other guards, Corporal Owen Riley and Private Ethan Brooks, along with Lieutenant Calloway. They spoke for several minutes, gesturing toward the mountains and then back at the barracks. Finally, Stone and Riley retrieved their hunting rifles from the armory building and disappeared into the tree line. The women spent the day trying to stay warm and conserve energy. Some attempted to exercise, knowing that movement generated heat, but their weakened state made even simple calisthenics exhausting. Lotte Schroeder, just 19 with blonde hair she kept in tight braids, stood watch at the window, her eyes following the tree line where the Americans had vanished. "Do you think they've abandoned us?" she asked in German, her voice small and frightened. "They haven't abandoned us," Ilse replied with more confidence than her face showed. "They're still here. See?" She pointed to smoke rising from the guard quarters on the far side of the compound. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the snow, 2 figures emerged from the forest. Sergeant Stone and Corporal Riley were dragging something behind them, leaving a dark trail in the white snow. As they drew closer, Bertha realized it was a deer, a large buck with impressive antlers. The men hauled it to a work area behind the kitchen building and began the process of field dressing the animal with practiced efficiency. An hour later, Private Brooks appeared at the barracks door carrying a heavy pot. The smell that preceded him made every woman in the room sit up straighter. Real meat, rich venison stew with actual chunks of protein visible in the thick broth. He also carried fresh bread that was still warm and notably less stale than their previous rations. "Stone figured you all needed something more substantial," Brooks said awkwardly as he set down the pot. "He and Riley will be hunting regular now, trying to supplement what the supply trucks can't get through." The supplement venison stew transformed more than just their physical state. For the first time since arriving at the mountain camp, the women went to sleep with full stomachs and a flicker of hope that they might survive this winter after all. Bertha lay awake that night, listening to the wind outside and thinking about Sergeant Stone's decision to hunt for them. It would have been easier for the Americans to simply maintain the inadequate rations and report that supply difficulties were beyond their control. Instead, these mountain men had chosen to share what the wilderness provided. 3 days later, Stone appeared at the barracks door just after dawn. He carried an armload of firewood and was followed by Corporal Riley with another load. Behind them came Private Brooks pulling a small sledge stacked with split logs. "We're going to teach some of you how to maintain these stoves properly," Stone announced, "and how to split wood. Can't have you freezing because nobody knows how to keep a fire going through the night." The request was unusual, possibly against regulations, but no one questioned it. Bertha volunteered immediately, along with Ilse and Elizabeth. Stone led them outside to the woodpile, where he demonstrated the proper way to split logs, how to identify dry wood from wet, and how to stack it for efficient burning. His hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this since childhood. "You're from the mountains," Bertha observed in her careful English. "Montana," Stone replied without looking up from his work. "Grew up hunting and trapping with my father. This cold here, it's nothing compared to some winters we had." He glanced at the women's inadequate coats and frowned. "You all need better gear. I'll see what I can do." That evening brought another change to their routine. Instead of having meals delivered to the barracks, Stone invited the women to eat outside around a large fire pit that had been cleared in the snow between the barracks and the guard quarters. The fire blazed high, throwing heat and light across the snow, creating an island of warmth in the frozen landscape. The smell of roasting meat filled the air as Riley turned a spit loaded with rabbit and what looked like wild turkey. Lieutenant Calloway stood to one side, clearly uncomfortable with this arrangement but not forbidding it. The regulations were unclear about this kind of fraternization, and the practical reality was that keeping the prisoners alive through winter required unconventional measures. Besides, they were so far from any oversight that decisions had to be made based on immediate necessity rather than distant bureaucracy. The women gathered around the fire, drawn by its warmth and the promise of another substantial meal. For a few minutes, no one spoke. Germans and Americans simply stood together in a circle around the flames, sharing heat and space in a way that transcended the war that had made them enemies. Bertha watched the firelight play across the faces around her, both familiar and foreign, and felt something shift inside her chest. Perhaps survival required more than just enduring. Perhaps it required learning to accept kindness, even from those you had been taught to hate. The storm arrived on December 28th with a ferocity that caught even the experienced mountain men off guard. Bertha woke to a sound like freight trains roaring past the barracks, wind so powerful it made the thick log walls shudder and groan. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, turning the world outside the windows into a white void where nothing existed beyond 3 feet of visibility. The temperature plummeted to levels that made their previous discomfort seem mild by comparison. By mid-morning, the 2 stoves in the barracks were struggling to maintain even minimal warmth despite being fed constantly. Frost formed on the inside of the windows and along the walls farthest from the heat sources. The women huddled together in the center of the room, wrapped in every blanket they possessed, but still they shivered uncontrollably. Krista's lips had taken on a bluish tint that frightened Bertha, and Elizabeth's cough had worsened into deep, rattling sounds that suggested pneumonia. The door burst open suddenly, letting in a blast of wind and snow that nearly extinguished both stoves. Sergeant Stone pushed inside, followed by Corporal Riley and Private Brooks. All 3 men were covered in snow and ice, their beards frozen solid. "We're evacuating you to the main hall," Stone shouted over the wind. "It's bigger and we can heat it better. Grab your blankets and follow us. Stay in line and hold on to the person in front of you. You lose sight of us in this whiteout, you'll die before you find shelter." The journey to the main hall was less than 50 yards but felt like miles. The wind tore at them with physical force, trying to rip blankets from their hands and push them off their feet. Snow stung exposed skin like needles. Bertha kept one hand locked on Ilse's shoulder in front of her and felt Lottie gripping her own coat from behind. Through the blinding white, she could barely make out Stone's broad back leading them forward. The main hall was a larger building used for administrative purposes and storage, with a massive stone fireplace at one end that Stone and Riley had stoked into a roaring blaze. The American guards had already moved their own bunks and supplies into the space. Now everyone, prisoners and guards alike, would shelter together until the storm passed. There was no other choice. Lieutenant Calloway stood near the fireplace, his face drawn with worry but his voice steady. "We pool our resources and body heat," he announced to both groups. "No segregation during this emergency. We have enough wood for maybe 3 days if we're careful. After that, we'll need to make decisions about rationing heat. For now, everyone gets close to the fire, and we rotate positions every hour so no one stays cold too long." The women moved toward the blessed warmth, and for the first time since their capture, they saw their American captors not as guards or enemies, but simply as other human beings trapped in the same desperate fight against nature's indifference to the politics of war. The blizzard raged for 4 days and 3 nights, trapping everyone inside the main hall with dwindling supplies and growing uncertainty about survival. But something unexpected happened during those desperate hours. The forced proximity and shared struggle began to dissolve the barriers that war had erected between captors and captives. There was no room for enmity when everyone depended on the same fire for warmth and the same limited food stores for sustenance. Sergeant Stone organized a rotation system for all tasks. German women and American soldiers took turns feeding the fire, preparing meals, and keeping watch on the storm's progress. Ilse, with her nursing background, worked alongside Dr. Margaret Lawson to care for Elizabeth, whose pneumonia had worsened dangerously. The two women communicated in a mixture of broken English, basic German, and medical terminology that transcended language barriers. Together they managed to bring Elizabeth's fever down using snowpacks and whatever medicines the small camp infirmary could provide. Corporal Riley discovered that Bertha had worked with radio equipment and spent an entire afternoon teaching her about the camp's communication system. His Iowa farm background had given him a practical approach to teaching that involved showing rather than explaining. Bertha found herself genuinely interested in the American military radio protocols, so different from the German systems she had trained on. Riley, in turn, was impressed by her technical knowledge and quick understanding of complex concepts. Private Brooks, the youngest of the guards, formed an unlikely friendship with Lotte and Rosa Klein. All three were barely out of their teenage years, and they gravitated toward each other with the natural affinity of youth. Brooks taught them card games to pass the long hours, and they taught him German drinking songs, though no alcohol was available to accompany them. Their laughter provided moments of lightness that everyone needed during the storm's darkest hours. On the third night, as the wind howled with renewed fury, Stone made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Tomorrow, if this storm breaks, we're going to need all hands to dig out. That means everyone works together. Prisoners, guards, doesn't matter. We survive together, or we don't survive at all." He looked around the hall, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "I know this wasn't how any of us expected this war to go, but right now, we're not Germans and Americans. We're just people trying to make it through winter." The words hung in the warm air above the fire. No one responded verbally, but Bertha saw heads nodding throughout the room, both American and German. When the evening meal was distributed, thin soup made from the last of their dried provisions, people sat in mixed groups rather than segregating by nationality. Conversations began tentatively, then grew more confident as both sides discovered that curiosity was stronger than hatred. For the first time since arriving at this mountain prison, Bertha allowed herself to believe that perhaps enemies could become something else when survival demanded it. The storm finally broke on January 2, 1945, revealing a landscape transformed into something both beautiful and treacherous. Snow had drifted as high as the barracks roofs in some places, while other areas were swept nearly bare by the relentless wind. The work of digging out took 3 full days, with everyone laboring side by side to clear paths between buildings and restore some semblance of normal camp operations. The shared effort continued the bonds that had formed during the storm. When the first supply truck finally made it through 2 weeks later, it brought more than food and firewood. There was mail for the American guards, packages from home filled with cookies, letters, and small reminders of the lives they had left behind. For the German women, there was nothing. They had sent letters through the International Red Cross months earlier, but no responses had come. The contrast was stark and painful. Bertha watched Private Brooks open a package from his mother, pulling out homemade fudge and a knitted scarf while reading a letter that made him smile and tear up simultaneously. The longing on the faces of the German women was palpable. They stood apart, trying not to intrude on the Americans' private joy, but unable to hide their own sense of isolation and abandonment. That evening, Sergeant Stone gathered the women in the main hall. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot before speaking. "The mail situation," he began, his voice gruff with emotion he was trying to hide. "It's not right that you've heard nothing from home. So, I wrote to my mother, asked her to organize some of the women in town to write to you all. Won't be the same as hearing from your own families, but thought you should know that someone's thinking about you. 2 weeks later, the letters arrived. Mrs. Dorothy Stone had rallied the women of her church to write to the German prisoners. The letters were simple, mostly describing daily life in the small Montana town, sharing recipes, and offering prayers for everyone's safety. They were signed by women with names like Ethel and Mildred and Ruth, strangers who had taken time to reach across an ocean of difference to offer simple human connection. Rosa Klein cried openly as she read her letter, the first personal correspondence she had received in over a year. Lotte traced the handwriting with her finger, as if touching the words could somehow bring her closer to the kindness they represented. Even the more stoic women like Ilsa and Elizabeth showed visible emotion. But the mail truck also brought newspapers, and with them came news that shattered whatever remained of the women's understanding of their homeland. The Allied advance into Germany was uncovering concentration camps. The reports described horrors that seemed impossible, atrocities committed in the name of the Reich they had served. Bertha read the articles with shaking hands, confronting a truth that made her question everything she had believed about her country and herself. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day reached the mountain camp via radio broadcast. The war that had defined their lives for years was finally over. In the main hall, American guards and German prisoners listened together to the announcement, but the atmosphere was complicated. For the Americans, there was relief, mixed with thoughts of those still fighting in the Pacific. For the German women, there was only uncertainty and dread about what came next. Lieutenant Calloway received orders from command 3 days later. The women were to be processed for repatriation within the month. They would be transported to processing centers, then eventually shipped back to Germany to face whatever remained of their homeland. The announcement should have brought relief, but instead, it brought a silence heavy with unspoken fear. That night, Bertha couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk thinking about Hamburg, the city she had left 2 years earlier. By all accounts, it had been bombed repeatedly and was now occupied by British forces. Her parents' address might not even exist anymore. Her brother had been serving on the Eastern Front, and she had heard nothing from him since 1943. What was she returning to? And perhaps more troubling, who was she returning as? The woman who had boarded that transport truck in December was not the same woman who would leave this mountain. She had learned English from her captors. She had worked beside them, laughed with them, survived winter's worst with them. She had read about the camps, about the systematic evil that had been carried out in Germany's name, and she could no longer separate herself from that guilt simply by claiming ignorance. The kindness shown to her by people like Sergeant Stone and Mrs. Dorothy Stone had taught her what her own country had failed to demonstrate, that enemies could choose to see each other's humanity. 3 days after the announcement, Bertha requested a meeting with Lieutenant Calloway. She found him in his office, surrounded by paperwork related to the upcoming repatriation. She stood in the doorway, rehearsing in her mind the words she had been practicing. "Lieutenant, I need to ask about the possibility of remaining in America." Calloway looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Remaining? You mean not returning to Germany?" Bertha nodded, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I know it is unusual, but I have been thinking about this carefully. Germany is destroyed. My family, I do not know if they live. But more than this, I do not know if I can return to a country that did such terrible things. Here, I have learned different things. Better things." The lieutenant removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Miss Meyer, I understand what you're saying, but the regulations are clear. You're a prisoner of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation. I don't have authority to grant what you're asking. But could you ask someone who does?" Bertha pressed. "Please. I am not the only one thinking this way." Lieutenant Calloway's inquiry to his superiors set off a bureaucratic debate that took weeks to resolve. During that time, the women divided into 2 groups based on their decisions about the future. 9 women, led by Bertha, had chosen to pursue the possibility of remaining in America if it could be arranged. 8 others, including Elizabeth, despite her still fragile health, decided they needed to return to Germany, regardless of what they might find there. The decision created no animosity between the groups. Both sides understood the impossibility of the choice they faced. Those returning felt a duty to their homeland, a need to contribute to rebuilding what had been destroyed. Those staying felt that their transformation required a complete break from the past, a chance to build lives based on what they had learned about human dignity and compassion. Sergeant Stone took a personal interest in helping those who wished to stay. He wrote to his mother again, asking if she and other families in Montana might consider sponsoring some of the women. The response was faster and more enthusiastic than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Dorothy Stone had organized 5 families willing to provide housing and employment assistance. Reverend Joseph Clark wrote offering to help navigate the legal complexities of changing their status from prisoners of war to displaced persons seeking immigration. Corporal Riley's family in Iowa offered to sponsor Ilsa, whose medical skills would be valuable in their rural community that lacked adequate nursing care. Private Brooks, showing a courage that surprised even himself, asked his parents to consider sponsoring Lotte, with whom he had formed a bond that had grown beyond simple friendship during the long winter months. The legal process proved complicated but not impossible. The women would need to officially renounce any allegiance to Germany, undergo extensive background investigations, and find American citizens willing to vouch for their character and provide financial support until they could become self-sufficient. Each woman would be closely monitored for the first year, with any violation of terms resulting in immediate deportation. For those returning to Germany, the camp organized a farewell gathering on June 15th. It was not a celebration but rather an acknowledgement of shared experience and mutual respect that had developed over 6 months. The women who were leaving gave small gifts to those staying, mostly handmade items they had created during the winter months. Those staying gave letters to be carried back to Germany, messages to be delivered if by chance any of their families could be located. Elizabeth embraced Bertha with tears streaming down both women's faces. "You are making the right choice for yourself," she said in German. "Do not feel guilty for staying. Germany needs people who return, but it also needs people who can show the world that Germans can learn, can change, can become better. You do that by staying here and living well." The trucks arrived at dawn the next morning to transport the 8 women to the processing center in Denver. Stone, Riley, Brooks, and even Lieutenant Calloway stood in formation to salute them as they departed. It was a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, but which now felt entirely appropriate. They had been enemies who became something else entirely through the simple act of surviving winter together. 20 years passed like water flowing down from the high peaks, steady and transforming everything in its path. Bertha Meyer returned to the Colorado Rockies in June of 1965, but she no longer came as a prisoner. She arrived as Bertha Stone, wife of Caleb Stone for 15 years, mother of 3 children who had never known war, and a naturalized American citizen who had built a life beyond anything she could have imagined during that desperate winter of '45. The old camp had been decommissioned years earlier, the barracks torn down and the land returned to wilderness, but the main hall still stood, converted now into a ranger station for the National Forest. Bertha stood before it with her husband and children, remembering the night they had all huddled around the fireplace, Germans and Americans together, while the blizzard tried to kill them all without discrimination. Her oldest son, Thomas, who was 13 and already showing signs of his father's height and steady temperament, asked the question she had been expecting. "Mom, Dad says you met here during the war. What was it really like?" Bertha looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly. She had told her children parts of the story before, but never all of it, never while standing in the place where it had actually happened. "It was cold," she began, her English now flawless but still carrying a trace of accent that marked her origins. "So cold that we thought we would not survive. The war had made us enemies, but the mountain did not care about our politics. The cold would have killed us all if we had remained enemies." She walked her children through the clearing, pointing to where the barracks had stood, where the fire pit had been, where Stone and Riley had brought in that first deer that had begun everything. "Your father saved our lives," she told them. "Not just with food and fire, but by showing us that we could choose to be different people than the war had tried to make us." Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. "You saved yourself, Bertha. I just gave you a chance to make a different choice." They had married in 1950, 3 years after she had gained full citizenship. The marriage had raised eyebrows in both communities, but by then both had learned to ignore opinions of those who had not lived through what they had experienced. Stone had returned to Montana after the war, and Bertha had followed when Mrs. Dorothy Stone offered continued sponsorship. Of the 9 women who had stayed, all had built successful lives in America. Ilsa had become head nurse at a hospital in Iowa. Lotte had married Ethan Brooks and was raising 4 children in Wyoming. The others had scattered across the country, maintaining correspondence filled with gratitude for second chances and determination to prove worthy of the trust placed in them. Bertha's youngest daughter, Dorothy, named after the woman who had first reached across the divide with kindness, tugged at her mother's hand. "Mama, would you have gone back to Germany if you could?" Bertha knelt down to look into her daughter's eyes. "Germany was where I was born," she said carefully. "But this mountain, this place where we learned that enemies can become family, this is where I chose to become who I am. That choice made all the difference."